Good evening, Kansas City. Thank you for tuning in to another installment of our Restore KC series. My name is Paul Gutierrez, Director of Programs and Events for the Kansas City Museum. We launched our Restore KC series back last summer of 2020 and a way for us to do virtual programs to have people connect, process, and heal. A quick update on the museum. Our staff and leadership are working really hard to open this museum this fall as a new museum of Kansas City history and culture heritage. In the meantime, we'll continue with these virtual programs. And this summer, my goal is to reactivate the lawn with safe, outdistance summer concerts, programs, and events. Tonight, we will be talking about the Missouri Bicentennial. This year marks the 200th annual celebration. And tonight, we're going to hear the multiple perspectives of the Missouri Bicentennial. My first guest is Dr. Gene T. Chávez.
Hello.
Hi, Dr. Chávez. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thanks for being with us. For those people who do not know you, do you let them know a little bit about yourself and what you do at the Kansas City Museum?
Yes. I've been associated with the Kansas City Museum, a wonderful Kansas City institution, since 2013, when the former director of the museum convened a group of Latinos from Kansas City and said, hey, we don't really have anything on Latinos at the Kansas City Museum. How can you help us? And so a group of us got together and started planning some programming. And so now 2021, fast forward, new director who still wants to have all groups represented. And so I've stayed with the museum as a historian, curator, jack of all trades. If it needs to be done, I'll try to get it done, especially if it has to do with Latino and other underrepresented populations.
That's correct. That's really important for the museum, as we are the museum of the whole story and of multiple perspectives. So, Dr. Chávez, thank you for your input in creating the scripts and being a good guidance for us with the museum gallery. So I really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Sean Rost, who's an oral historian.
Hello.
Hi, Sean. How are you?
Very nice to be here, Paul.
For those that might not know you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and where you work?
Certainly. So I primarily work as the oral historian for the State Historical Society of Missouri at its Columbia Research Center on the University of Missouri campus. And we have research centers across the state, Kansas City, St. Louis, Rolla, Cape Girardeau, and Springfield. And I also worked in consulting work on oral history and other projects with the Missouri Humanities Council. In addition to that, I teach from time to time at the University of Missouri in Columbia, doing the history surveys, American History 2, 1865 and since 1865, as well as the History of Missouri class.
Thank you, Sean. Before we begin your presentation, I want to let our audience know that at the end, there'll be Q&A for both our speakers. So if you have any comments or feedback, just drop them in the box below. And at the end, I'll come back to the screen to share those questions. Also, this program is being recorded. And thanks to One Kansas City Radio, it will be available on a podcast. So without any further ado, I'll let Sean start his presentation.
Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. For my presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about Missouri at 200 years ago. And as we're looking at not only the bicentennial of the state, but also really the story of the Santa Fe Trail as well, talking about this point in time in Missouri and how significant Central Missouri was in the role not only in the development of early Missouri history, but also in this development of the Santa Fe Trail. Now, in Central Missouri, we really have a meeting place of a lot of different groups and a lot of different cultures in the lead up to what is eventually the Louisiana Purchase. Of course, there are Native and Indigenous peoples throughout the region for generations prior to any European settlement and arrival in the region. And of course, up until the point of the Louisiana Purchase, you were having French territorial claims to portions of what is now Missouri, Spanish claims as well, and then eventually the French once more before the United States kind of takes over portions of the area starting soon after in 1804. Now, Missouri, in the sense coming into statehood in 1821, and it can be a confusing topic because if we think back to our elementary school and high school days, and even in college perhaps, we often think of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and we assume that Missouri very easily transitioned into the United States as a state in 1820. But when we hear that 2021 is Missouri's bicentennial, we may scratch our head and wonder, how can that be? Well, it took a little while for Missouri to actually not only gain statehood, but for it to be officially recognized by the United States government. And it was really a growing of the population in the early 19th century along the region known as the Boonslick Trail that went from St. Louis into portions of central Missouri that really spurred a lot of this population growth. In 1820, when Missouri is beginning to apply for statehood, it's initially accepted on the grounds that Maine being brought in as a free state would make Missouri as a slave state even the balance between free and slave, which was a major concern not only in Congress but nationwide at that point. So,
hey, Sean,
yes.
Quick, your PowerPoints, I don't know if you're going through your screens, but it's still on the same first slide.
Oh, it's not even on, is it on a map or on just the same first slide?
It's on the first one, so we're sorry about that. Not sure.
Oh. How about now? Any change?
No change.
Okay, well, technology is not going to be my friend today, I suppose, so I'll just continue on.
Oh, there it is, right there. There we go.
I'm sorry, everyone, if I'm causing a bit of an error here. Any change now?
Yes, there's a change. That's the first map. Right?
Okay, perfect. So technology can be my friend sometimes too. Thank you, Paul, for clarifying that. I did want to show the images to everybody, but I'm glad technology is working on my end. So essentially what happens in 1821 is Missouri is forced to reestablish its state constitution. The original one had been rejected by the United States Congress, and they cited primarily the fact that Missouri was going to establish a law that was going to ban essentially people of color from moving into the state. It was going to regulate people of color and not allow them any sort of migration into the state or any sort of establishment of identity in the region. All non-white immigration was going to be barred, essentially. The Congress and the President of the United States at that point, James Monroe, says you cannot do that. That is unconstitutional. And to meet the requirement of Congress, the Missouri General Assembly says that we will not pass such a law. And that voice of saying we're not going to pass a law was enough to convince James Monroe to sign the Statehood Proclamation on August 10th, 1821, which is officially Missouri Statehood Day. Soon afterwards, Missouri goes back on its word and quickly passes a number of laws designed to not only regulate enslaved people, but to regulate all people of color within the state's boundaries. And that's very quickly soon afterwards and continues on into the American Civil War. Now, in the development of early Missouri, there are a number of important elements that we need to understand for what life was like along not only the Boonslick Trail, but also the Santa Fe Trail as well. It really centers on a county called Howard County. And we can see it there right smack dab in the middle of this map, what's called Old Franklin. Howard County is considered to be one of the first major counties in Missouri, and several counties in the state branch off of it to form their own individual counties as the population increases. Now, the Boone's Oak Trail is going to gain its name from, of course, Daniel Boone and his family, who migrate from the east into Missouri and set up in an area around Defiance and Matson along Warren County and St. Charles counties today. But the movement continues on into the west towards Howard County, where a number of salt licks are found along the Missouri River area. And Boone and family kind of set up shop over there and begin to develop a salt business, shipping and preserving goods to eastern markets. Now, soon afterwards with Howard County, there is a population boom that really spurs a lot of not only territorial claims and statehood claims, it really brings about the development of Missouri as being a significant portion of the United States. But of course, we need to understand really how that develops and where that comes about in central Missouri. You have people moving from New England and portions of the old Northwest area, which is today the upper Midwest, into portions of Missouri. You have people moving from the upper South, Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky, and the Carolinas into Missouri. So you have a meeting of various individual groups, and predominantly it is a region of slaveholders. And that becomes quite important when we consider not only the laws passed, but really the power held in that region. And in fact, arguably, the political structure of central Missouri not only caused significant impact in the General Assembly, but also influences things like the Santa Fe Trail as well. In fact, Missouri's 10 governors from 1821 to 1851, 7 of them lived a significant portion of their life in central Missouri, most of them coming in and around Howard, Cooper, and Saline counties, going west into Jackson and Lafayette counties as well. Now, this development is on a number of different ways. One is the Boone's Oak Trail, like I said, and the images here, kind of the most notable one of Boone passing through the Cumberland Gap, as well as the burial place of Daniel Boone and family near Marthasville in Warren County. And we can see, yes.
I think we're having technical difficulties. Your slide's still on the second map.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. I'm having all sorts of fun.
There it is.
Okay, we'll leave it on this for now. I won't touch anything else. Don't mess anything else up.
Yeah, it seems to be working now when you click.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so these newspaper images we can see here really kind of tell us a lot about what's going on in central Missouri here as we get into the 1820s and early statehood. We can see the sale of land as people are moving into the region. We can see the development of communities and identities, stores and shops and doctors. And of course, we can see 2 key elements of the region that will play an economic role as well as a social and political role as well, which is the development of small-scale slavery in the region, as well as the further development of the Santa Fe Trail. And this kind of image here from the Missouri Intelligencer and Boone's Lick Advertiser from 1829 really centers a lot of that. We can see in one singular image here from a newspaper, not only the sale of goods and preparation for the Santa Fe Trail, but also the hiring out system that existed in Missouri slavery, small-scale slavery, and even celebrations of the 4th of July. Now, these people living along the Missouri River and on the early formation of the Santa Fe Trail are well aware of events around them. The newspapers they're reading of are sharing events around the globe, but they're also quite attuned to the economic system going on around them. For example, being on the Missouri River, they are quite aware of what their corn as well as their tobacco are going to be worth on markets like St. Louis and in places like New Orleans, even down the river. Additionally, we can see kind of replications of the life along the river there in resident George Caleb Bingham's paintings, like this one of Watching the Cargo in 1849. Additionally, slavery becomes quite significant in the region as we have Upper South in the region. They're going to establish a system of slavery that is small, not so much replicating deep South plantation style, but still quite noticeable in how it is impacting the local economy and certainly the system of control that is placed upon the enslaved person in their ability to do much of anything in life. And we can see these images here from the Intelligencer, the sale of enslaved people, and certainly the elements of escape. And Missouri slavery is significant in that regard, as there are free territory and free states around all of Missouri's eastern, western, and northern borders. So slavery and the escape of enslaved people becomes quite significant and well. If we think about the growth of slavery in around the same time period, we can see in this image here from the 1870 census just how it exploded in many ways throughout the region. Howard County, which is kind of the focus there at the beginning, we can see the growth of that over time up to the Civil War, as well as neighboring counties like Cole County and Cooper County in the same region there. We can see the significantly large number of enslaved people over time. Finally, and as Dr. Chávez will talk about here shortly, the development of the Santa Fe Trail becomes immensely significant. Missouri was in economic straits in a lot of ways at the time of its statehood. There was an economic depression in 1819. Issue over hard money versus paper money was a significant issue. And the development of a network connecting people in Howard County and later in places like Jackson County, Independence, and Westport, to distant locations like Santa Fe, and the trade network between the two really becomes quite significant, to where we can see advertisements in newspapers not only suggesting what's coming up in terms of Santa Fe traders and the latest news to come out of Santa Fe, but also even the development of certain items for the long Santa Fe Trail, such as this one in the center here from Benson and Company, which talks about a medicine that is written with directions printed in, as it says, the Spanish language, ordered expressly for the Santa Fe trade from 1829. Ultimately, in a lot of ways, the Santa Fe Trail becomes significant for Missouri because of its role to play not only in the development of communities. Think of Independence and later Kansas City growing in a lot of ways from this trade networks with Santa Fe going southwest, Oregon and California later in the 1840s, but also really the power held by those who were connected to the Santa Fe trade becomes important. Missouri's early political leaders between the 1820s and the 1850s had a significant tie to the development not only of slavery within Missouri's borders, but also the development of the Santa Fe trade and trading to the west and to the southwest at the very same time. So when we think about Missouri's bicentennial, we think ultimately about the state and its establishment, and then the usual story of the Missouri Compromise and how that impacted American politics at the time. But in a lot of ways, looking at the micro level, looking at the localized level, what is going on in a place like Howard County or Independence in Jackson County and Westport is significant to understand not only what is going on with shifting forces in the world around them, but also how these events, such as the Santa Fe Trail, issues involving slavery, and issues involving trade, really connected these residents to the larger world around them. With that, I'll change it over to Dr. Chávez.
Okay, just to make sure the technology is working, do you see my screen?
Not yet, Dr. Chávez.
Okay, hold on.
I really love this presentation because the museum is always talking about the multiple perspectives of history. So what's the other side of history? So I think this is one example of the future programs that will exist once we're allowed to come inside the museum, safe distance, but just to give the audience of what's to come, of what programs they hope to see at the new Kansas City Museum.
All right, are we seeing the screen now?
Not yet.
Okay, let me.
I'll remind the audience that if you have any questions or comments at the end, I'll come back and ask both of them. Just add them on the Dropbox below on Facebook.
All right, are we there?
Almost. You see, we got it.
Okay. I'm going to try opening in full screen presentation mode. Do you have it now?
You need to share your presentation, Dr. Chávez.
Well, I am. It says stop sharing. Okay. Okay. Do you see it now? Are you seeing it, Paul?
Not yet. Go ahead and share your screen, and I believe to share the PowerPoint, just like we did earlier.
Okay, I have it. Oh, okay. How about now?
Not yet. I think we'll forgo the PowerPoint and we'll just have you speak, Dr. Chávez, and have you have a conversation with Sean, going back and forth with no PowerPoint. What do you think?
Well, I'll tell you what. You're able to hear my voice now, so I think I'll just go ahead and talk through the PowerPoint and without sharing it.
Sounds good.
I really appreciate Sean giving us the historical and political background of what was happening in Missouri, particularly with the advent of people from the South, especially the northern part of the South, who established what they called Little Dixie, and in fact, the use of small scale large scale farming operations with slaves, not large in number, but slaves that were involved in the trade of hemp, especially, and tobacco that was produced in Missouri along the Missouri River in an area along many counties called Little Dixie. I think that influx of people coming from the east to Missouri actually put Missouri in a strategic place to use the river system of rivers from back east, the Ohio, the Mississippi, and the Missouri rivers to bring trade goods to the West. And Missouri was sort of that frontier state that eventually connected with the Latino trade that was happening for over 300 years along the Camino Real from Mexico City all the way up into Santa Fe and through the various river systems within the United States. That movement, the logistical and strategic movement of goods along the rivers and then the trails made actually the expansion of people of the United States possible. And of course, the counter narrative of that, or the alternate question is, yes, the United States was expanding, and that was good for the United States, but at the expense of Native people as well as the Hispanic people that occupied what is today's southwestern part of the United States. So when you think about 300 years of Spanish colonial domination that took place in the Latino world, and especially in the Empire of Mexico during the 300 years of colonial occupation of Spain, and actually its claim upon territories that eventually became Missouri as a result of the Louisiana Purchase, when Spain lost the war to France, and the territories that the Spanish held that were part and the most part of the Louisiana Purchase was ceded to France, and then France in turn sold it to Thomas Jefferson, and then the westward expansion of people from the 13 colonies began to expand greatly. But thinking about the Santa Fe Trail, the trail itself was really a trail that was used by Taos Pueblo, as well as other Pueblo people of the Tewa people that the Spanish called the Pueblo for hundreds of years. And the Tewa and other tribes of the Pueblo Indians were trading with the Plain Indians over centuries of time during that time of the Spanish colonial period and before. So when the Spanish came in and began to develop their trade systems with the indigenous people and with their settlers in the north, the northern part of the Kingdom of Mexico, then actually New Mexico became a very important part. Taos was actually the terminus of the El Camino Real, where the people from all across the Hispanic world to the south did trade with the people of the north, and those trails were very useful. The Spanish had developed the hacienda system for the settlement of their land. In a sense, it was somewhat like the plantation system in that the hacienda was self-sufficient. It was headquarters for extensive ranching and farming operations. And really the cattle industry was introduced by the Spanish in the 1600s. And actually at the third voyage of Christopher Columbus, he had brought cattle and other livestock. And that whole livestock industry was very important. And important to that livestock industry was the development of the mule, which later became significant on the Santa Fe Trail. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But when you think about what the traders who crossed the plains of Kansas into Missouri, that had been happening for literally hundreds of years. So that when we celebrate the 200th anniversary of William Bucknell's expedition in 1821, it really wasn't the initial trading along that route, but in fact, there is evidence in Spanish documents that many would-be traders preceded him and the 1821 celebration that we celebrate this year. You know, the French, especially French Malay brothers in 1737, traveled from Illinois country, where they were doing trapping, to the Spanish kingdom of Nuevo Mexico, seeking trade opportunities. Others, including other Frenchmen, John J. de Alary, Pierre Sabtran, and Pedro Vidal, crisscrossed the grassy plains of Kansas out of where they had been trapping in the Ozark Hills of Missouri in 1882, hoping to gain trade concessions from the Spanish colonial government. And between 1790 and 1821, a New Mexican who knew the trail well by the name of Juan Lucero made at least 13 trips in and out of Kansas plains into Missouri along that corridor that eventually became the Santa Fe Trail. Now, as a mercantile empire, Spain, like France and England, really discouraged trade with anyone else other than their own colonies. And Spain was very much like that for fear of their loss of monopoly. But when Mexico gained its independence on September 27th, 1821, again, another bicentennial celebration, Mexico gained not only its independence from Spain, but it also gained the opportunity to trade with its neighbor to the north, its expanding neighbor to the north, so that the Empire of Mexico, and then later called the Republic of Mexico, really began trade and welcomed trade and the opportunity to trade with its neighbor to the north, since they were no longer trading with Spain and had no obligation to trade only with Spain. So when Bucknell followed that trail that had been used for hundreds of years by native people, later the French, and then the Spanish themselves, who made many journeys, it was important that they connect, especially with the logistics of the river travel and the movement of manufactured goods, since the United States in the late 1880s or middle 1880s and late 1880s was experiencing an industrial revolution, much like the one that was shared by England at an earlier, just shortly previous to the American Industrial Revolution. After Mexico gained its independence, a governor of New Mexico, and it was called, it was still part of Mexico, but it was called the Kingdom of New Mexico in northern Mexico. A governor by the name of Bartolome Baca was especially interested and instrumental in fostering the trade on the trail. Baca developed in 1824 a entourage and sent couriers to Council Groves, Kansas, announcing that New Mexico planned to march 1,500 men to Missouri to pacify the Indians along the route, especially the Osage, the Comanche, the Pawnee, and other Indian tribes who were attacking people not only in Kansas, but especially the Osage in Missouri, even though the Osage had some trade agreements with the French. But as far as the Spanish or the English settlers, they were more in opposition to those settlers. So Baca in 1825 commissioned Manuel Escudero, the first Mexican to take a caravan along the Santa Fe Trail to visit the United States to discuss commerce. Escudero, who was a member of the Chihuahua Provincial Assembly, appeared before the U.S. Congress to ask for greater protection for the Mexican traders. He himself had been robbed in a trade expedition by the Osage on the left banks of the Arkansas River, for which he gained compensation eventually from the United States. And it should be noted that the border with Mexico at this period of time in 1821 was really at the Arkansas River. So the Arkansas River that runs through the middle of Kansas from Colorado on into Arkansas was really the Mexican border at this time period. It wasn't at the Rio Grande River. Now, later on in 1846, the U.S. launched a war against Mexico. The dispute really started when the Texans, along with both Hispanic and Anglo-Texans from the state of Texas, decided that they wanted to break from the government of Mexico. Mexico had gained its independence in 1821, and by 1836, Texas had actually gained its own statehood. And in that same year, the U.S. annexed Texas under the guise of protecting their citizens in Texas from Mexico. And we know about the Alamo and what took place in Texas and the war with Mexico. But that continued in 1846 to 1848 with the eventual signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And in that treaty, the people were guaranteed the right to their land. The people of Mexico and the former Spanish Empire and now the Republic of Mexico, they were guaranteed the right to their land, the right to their language, the right to their way of life. But that soon changed, we know, as Anglos began to expand to the west and to the southwest. So after the Mexican War, the U.S. annexed all of the territory that had belonged to Mexico, and that territory was really became part of the United States. What is today California, Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, all of those southwestern states were part of Mexico, but after 1848, with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico lost all of that territory. They were monetarily compensated to the tune of $8 million, but really the resources of that whole southwest part was lost to Mexico forever. While Mexico objected to the annexation, they eventually agreed to it. And then later, the southern part of the most northern part, what it is today, southern New Mexico and southern Arizona, was purchased in a purchase by the Gadsden. It was called the Gadsden Purchase because a company wanted to purchase that land to build a railroad across that southern tip of the newly gained annexed territory. So that, in essence, opened up trade, and the literature about the Santa Fe Trail that we study in the United States and that most people look at when they think about the Santa Fe Trail it celebrates the Americans and some of the Western Europeans that moved goods and services along the trail. It often portrays them as daring explorers and visionaries who initiated commercial relationships between the United States and Mexico. But it often overlooked an equally significant role was played by Hispanos, and that's what they called themselves. They didn't say Hispanic, Latino, or Latinx. They called themselves Hispanos because they identified with their roots in Spain. Susan Calafate Boyle, who has written extensively about the capitalistas, Hispano merchants on the Santa Fe Trail, mentions that, in fact, these traders, these capitalists, who had been former landholders, large hacienda holders and landowners who had capital to spend, were really the prime movers of goods and services along the trail south, because they brought it into Santa Fe, but from Santa Fe it was distributed throughout the Hispanic world by the system of caminos reales, all the way to the California coast and all the way south to eventually the Isthmus of Panama and some into South America. So that trail, the Chihuahua Trail, which was part of one of the Camino Real, was very important. So beginning in 1826, the Chávez, Armijo, Perea, Ortero families, all prominent aristocratic families of New Mexico, engaged in commerce along the trail. So by 1837, right after Texas gained its independence, there was vigorous trade by Hispanics along the trail. And it's important to note, as reported by Calafato in her book that I mentioned, is that New Mexico entrepreneurs, with their extensive networks of trade in the Hispano world, facilitated the geographical expansion of trade between Mexico and the United States, especially along, again, the river systems, and the Missouri River played a very important role. In 1837, Juan Esteban Pino, a wealthy landholder in New Mexico and entrepreneur, made a request to the Mexican government for an exemption from Mexican import duties on behalf of himself and others who he called, in his letter to Mexico City, capitalistas, signifying that they had money to spend and enter into commerce with the United States and wanted the levy of duty taxes at least made lighter for them. The significant role of Pino and his fellow entrepreneurs in opening the trade on the Santa Fe Trail has long been neglected, Calafato says, by historians. And so in a sense, we're telling kind of the other side of the trail from the south north and what was taking place in Mexico at the same time that things were happening in the state of Missouri during this significant time of 1821. The trail itself lasted from 1821 to 1880, when in fact the various traders, prominent traders of New Mexico, like the Aguirre family, like people who, like the Vacas, like Francisco Pareja and Francisco Chávez, who both were educated, by the way, in St. Louis. They were cousins, and they both had gone to St. Louis University, but they were from New Mexico. And many prominent families from New Mexico sent their children to St. Louis to go to school. Eventually, many of the New Mexicans during the Civil War joined on the side of the Union and helped keep the Confederacy away from New Mexico, because the Confederacy basically had designs on the territories that had been ceded to the United States from Mexico, and wanted to bring them into the Union as slave states. But men like Pareja and Chávez were really decorated Union soldiers who eventually leveraged their service for the Union Army into becoming territorial representatives in the U.S. Congress, as did others. One of the biggest traders on the Santa Fe Trail after 1852 was a man by the name of Pedro Jose Ignacio Aguirre, and he was a prosperous hacendado, owner of a hacienda in Chihuahua. But he was having trouble with the Mexican government. They accused him of being disloyal. And so after 1848, he decided to move across the border, which was now at the Rio Grande River, and set up shop in southern New Mexico in Las Cruces. And so by 1852, he had started a vigorous trade along the Santa Fe route, the Santa Fe Trail, and actually became a rich merchant on the trail. His three oldest sons were probably the largest operators on the Santa Fe Trail at one time, and held the most government contracts, that is, those contracts to supply the bases or forts that the U.S. government had established. An interesting thing about one of the Aguirre boys was a young man by the name of Epifanio, and he came to Westport to a mercantile store that is now Kelly's Bar in Westport. And there he met Mary Mamie Barnard, who was the daughter of the proprietor. And they began to court, and eventually Epifanio and Mary Barnard Aguirre married, or Barnard married, and she became a person who supported his work. Unfortunately, Epifanio was in one of his expeditions along the trail. His wagon train was attacked by Apaches, and he himself was killed. So Mamie had to continue the business, along with his two brothers, Pedro Aguirre and Eugenio Aguirre. As I mentioned, they were probably the largest Hispanic traders along the trail. The Baca family was another who belonged to the Hispano elite class, who educated all of their children back in Eastern colleges. From St. Louis, they moved on to New York and other places. And the Miguel Antonio Otero, who was actually born in the United States, since he was born in New Mexico, and attended St. Louis University. He became very important in the movement of the Santa Fe Trail, from being a trail to actually being a merchant on the Santa Fe Trail. He exploited his notoriety in the United States as a successful entrepreneur, and actually became a congressional delegate to the U.S. Congress. And his firm, he established a partnership with David Whiting and in Kansas City, Missouri, and eventually they also maintained an office in New York City. During the Civil War, that firm supplied both sides, so Otero got in a little bit of trouble, but he supplied their operations, supplied materials both to the Confederacy as well as the Union. He eventually overcame that stigma and continued his business in Kansas City, and then as the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe Railways Company began to move west, he provided the mercantile and supplies that were necessary for the workers and the people who were building the railroads on into Santa Fe. And he eventually lobbied Congress to open up the railroad and to purchase the land, and persuaded New Mexico to allow the Santa Fe Railroad and other railways to develop in New Mexico. And so we find that the Santa Fe Trail turned into the Santa Fe Railroad. On February 9th, 1880, the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe Railway Company pulled into its first train into Santa Fe, New Mexico Depot. Its arrival was celebrated with colorful speeches and a grand parade. With that train, the treacherous journey by horseback, covered wagon, or stagecoach on the rutted old Santa Fe Trail came to an end, and an era of economic and social change began as both countries began to interact with one another. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Paul.
Thank you, Dr. Rost and Dr. Chávez, for sharing those perspectives. Before we go into Q&A, some questions came in. I'll let our audience know that both PowerPoints will have them on our website, a link, so you can go back and see those presentations.
Right.
What's one takeaway that we should have, audience should have from your presentation, starting with Dr. Rost?
Well, first of all, I think Dr. Chávez's presentation is extremely important, and I think it really touches on a significant portion of the Santa Fe Trail, and something that I think is tied back to Missouri significantly. People living in Howard County, in later Jackson County, they were very much looking west, but they were thinking really only in many ways of themselves and of the commerce. And even in their writings of that time, they're very much focused on the fact that they are going to explore the West. They are going to, in their eyes, bring civilization to the West. They're going to bring goods and make money and bring it back to the East. And I think when we look at the Santa Fe Trail, as Dr. Chávez pointed out, we need to look at it as a two-way path. It's involving many different groups and many different individuals, and it's important to see it in that regard. And I think that is critical in understanding that. The people in Missouri at that point, certainly viewed themselves as people moving west. They had moved from Virginia and from the Carolinas, Kentucky and Tennessee, and then moved into Missouri. And they saw it as perhaps a stopping point before further transportation to the west. And I think the power that they held on the eastern end of the Santa Fe Trail going to the west certainly had an impact not only on themselves and on Missouri and the nation, as they spread out trade goods in all different directions, but also the way they ran politics in the establishment of Missouri in its first couple of decades, and ultimately how their views on trade and their view on the Santa Fe Trail impacted the New Mexican trade and people in New Mexico and people in the West. So I think that's certainly important, as Dr. Chavez pointed out, to understand, yes, there is a starting point in Missouri, but it was not the only starting point. It involved many different groups. I think that is critically important.
Dr. Chavez?
Yes, thank you, Sean. Yeah, I think if there's a takeaway that I would like for people to have is the point that Sean is making, that it was a two-way thoroughfare, north and south, or northwest and south, southwest, that in fact was important. It was important in that money in Mexico, the landed aristocracy, the money individuals, the capitalists of New Mexico had the wherewithal to purchase the goods. If it had not been for the capitalists of Mexico and New Mexico, and I know there's often a lot of confusion because people don't understand when Mexico became Mexico in that strategic year of 1821, and often think of Mexico as a poor, struggling country. No, it was a country. Yes, it was a new country, having gained its independence in 1821. But there was a great deal of wealth from the not only political but economic elite of Mexico, who had the financial resources to purchase the goods and then distribute them along their trade routes that were well established over the Spanish colonial period, and thus they were making money as providing an opportunity for the industrialists who were manufacturing these goods to have a market, because certainly there wasn't a huge market in the West. It was just recently being settled during this period. I mean, there weren't that many Anglo and other Europeans, Americans in the Western states at this period of time. The population was really in the Hispano world. And so without that Hispano world, there would not have been a market for these goods.
Great, thank you for that. One question that came up is, why do you think that sometimes we don't hear the other side of history? There's only like one perspective. In your opinion, why does sometimes we only hear one side of the story, so to say?
Go ahead, Sean.
Okay, so I think in a lot of ways, an example of this is we think about the history books that are written over time. And for someone who was attending a school, let's say, for example, in Missouri, I actually own a history book from a Missouri school from 1893. And its perspective on history is very much about the movement of people west, people who are from predominantly Protestant white backgrounds. And they're writing about, in a lot of ways, a hero complex, that they are saving people, they are bringing them up to their level, that they are civilizing the world. And this is what was being taught for generations and generations and generations. And it was really not until the evolution and the development of social history that there is a wider understanding from people living in certain parts of the United States about all the people that were involved. And unfortunately, that's really only been to an extent a recent trend, that people have not engaged too heavily with all voices in history and understanding all those who were involved, from the people making the policies at a political level, at a governmental level, all the way down to the individual who was impacted by those very same policies in many ways. So I think it's been unfortunately something more recent, although certainly we can trace back some elements of social history back generations. But if we were to think of a general Missouri school child, a century ago, their version of history is going to be very, very one-sided in one perspective, and it's going to be very much about the glory of history, the glory of settlement, and not so much about the people who already lived in various parts of the United States, people who had generations of family, who had their own oral traditions, who had their own religions and cultural practices. It was very much about one identity and not so much many different identities.
I would agree wholeheartedly with Sean. You know, I'm often asked to go speak to social studies classes in schools. And I spoke to a school group just recently, about 3 weeks ago. And the school's name is the Santa Fe Trail Middle School in Olathe. So my first question to the students was, how many of you know about the Santa Fe Trail, the trail after which your school is named? And there were only 2 hands that went up in a class of about 26 youngsters. And I think the whole idea of telling one side of the story, you know, in our textbooks, and not really getting the full story of what really happened and who were the players involved, the multi-ethnic players involved in any subject we might address, wherever you have diverse people. And so we had a wonderful discussion with those middle school students, and I think it illustrates how lacking our teaching of the full history of people in schools is even yet today. And I think it's important that we, and I think that's why the work of the Kansas City Museum and other places are really trying to tell the full story of what really took place.
Thank you so much for your perspective. Another question that just came in from Jennifer. She asks, did the Santa Fe Trail trade result in Hispanios settling in KC region in the 1800s?
Yes, especially the late 1800s. There weren't large numbers until the Mexican Revolution of 1810 to 1821, and that period when over 1 million Mexicans left Mexico. Many, and I would say the majority, crossing the Rio Grande and coming to the United States. The only difference then and now is that they weren't turned back because laborers were needed, and so they were welcomed in the United States. In fact, there were contractors waiting for them during that period. And so that's when the largest settlement of Hispanos came. And by that time, they had a strong identity as being Mexicanos or Mexicans. But during the period of 1821 to 1880, the period of the Santa Fe Trail, most of them didn't settle in Kansas or Missouri. Some did, like the Oteros, a large family of merchants, because they set up businesses. They had the capital to set up business, and they took Missouri partners. But they often, the elite of Mexico often sent their children to St. Louis and later to St. Joseph, Missouri, to go to school. So there were people who eventually settled out, and there was a Hispano elite during the period of the Mexican Revolution. Many of the political leaders went to St. Louis and to Kansas City, and so they were at that point political refugees in the sense that they were leaders trying to take a side, either on the side of the Mexican federal government or the revolutionaries like Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, and others.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Chávez. Dr. Rost, anything to add?
I think Dr. Chávez summed it up very perfectly. I think in a lot of ways, from when I was reading from a lot of those newspapers from the 19th century, there are reports certainly of people coming, certainly from New Mexico into Missouri, but it's more so connected to the trade, not so much in the actual living and establishment in some of these communities farther east into the Missouri River Valley.
Yeah, it was the Santa Fe Railroad that really brought large numbers of Hispanics to initially to work laying tracks, the arduous work of laying track for not only the Santa Fe Railroad, but Missouri Southern and other lines. So wherever railroad tracks were laid, you're going to find Mexican communities to this day all along those railroad lines, especially the Santa Fe and the Missouri Southern, and the Union Pacific as well in the southwestern part of the United States.
Great, thank you both. Another question is, how did Missourians talk about the Santa Fe Trail in newspapers and their writing?
Well, certainly, I found a number of kind of individual diaries that were writing about Santa Fe, and certainly talking about when to leave. And for them, April was the time to pack up and prepare to leave to go towards Santa Fe, because the argument was when the materials were not only prepared and ready to come through to the river landings, but also when the grasses of the prairie were enough to sustain livestock for a longer journey. But I think one that really struck me, and I'll read directly from it because I think it's quite eye-opening in a lot of ways for what it's saying, is from a person recounting their father's travels on the Santa Fe Trail in the 1830s. So this person would have been writing later on in the 19th century, but certainly offering a perspective on it. And they refer to New Mexico as a very picturesque location, a very notable place. And they write about what happens on the trail, kind of making camp, encountering various groups, the long, arduous trail, picking which route to go, either through Colorado or cutting through directly on the southern route into New Mexico. But this is how he basically referred to Santa Fe and New Mexico and the people living there when he's writing this. He says, quote, "Traversing a wild, unexplored, and chartless country, this little band of people," referring to his father's group, "left all civilization behind them and plunged into a land known only to the wild beasts. In traversing the same country today, one is scarcely out of sight of some church spire or the commodious schoolhouse, those potent reminders of advanced civilization." So certainly we can see in the 19th century how this person from Missouri is referring to simply stepping off into Kansas and going towards New Mexico in that point of time in the 19th century, of how they saw not their journey and they saw themselves, but what they thought they would encounter and what they thought life was like, just beyond what they saw as, quote, civilization in portions of central Missouri.
Yeah. I think that people of that era did not understand, and in fact, there was a certain prejudice, if you will, at that time, which was in Spanish literature.
Oh, I believe we lost Dr. Chávez with some. There you are, sir. I see you again.
Okay. So La Leyenda Negra was a rivalry between two imperialist powers, Spain and England, or the British Empire. So as they were empire building, both countries did everything they could to run down the other country. So for people of the British Empire, especially the English, there was no good Spaniard, and the Spaniards, of course, returned in kind their dislike for the British. And so on the high seas, they often vied for power and for territories as they built their empires. And that La Leyenda Negra, the Black Legend, continued, I think, for centuries in the Americas, so that English settlers, even though Hispanics and Spain sided with the colonies against England and provided beef, because the Hispanics had developed the cattle industry long before the cattle industry was developed in the United States. And in the 1600s, on the third voyage of Columbus, he actually brought longhorn cattle to the Americas by ship, and they started a vigorous livestock industry, especially cattle, sheep, pigs, and so forth. So the Continental Army was sustained by the cattle that Governor Galvez sent up the Mississippi to help the American Revolutionary Army against England. But in the mind of many Anglo-Americans, especially Anglo-Americans, maybe some German Americans of that period, they did not have high opinions of Hispanic people. And I think that prejudice, so often, like on the trail, they didn't encounter the economic elite of Mexico. They encountered the workers who were underneath the wagons greasing. And so the Mexicans got the name greasers. So often people would say, oh, those Mexicans, or they mispronounce it purposely to say Mexicans. Those Mexicans, a bunch of dirty people who are uncivilized. So they could easily scandalize or some way think less of people unless they knew the history and really knew the culture. The first university in the Americas was established in Mexico City long before Harvard was ever established. The second university was in Lima, Peru. And yet, people they're ignorant of that understanding of the development of the Hispanic world for 300 years, longer than the United States has been a nation, actually.
Thank you both. Another question just came in from Edgar. When was the Argentine-Mexican community first established?
It was first established in that period of 1910 to 1930, when people were leaving Mexico because of the Mexican Revolution. The Santa Fe Railroad yards and the smeltering operation in Argentine were two big draws for Mexican laborers. And so, and agriculture was also a draw for Mexican laborers. And also the ice plant operations that were located in Argentina and along the Santa Fe and Union Pacific railroad tracks. So as cars carrying produce and other perishables came into Argentina, it was Mexican workers for the most part, and some other immigrants who iced down those box cars. So during that period of 1910 to 1930, that's when the bulk of that population, the Mexican population, came to Argentina. And like many barrio or colonia enticements, where they have their own grocery stores, their own social life, fiestas, churches in Spanish and so forth. It continues to draw Mexican immigrants as well as other Latinos now that people are coming from Central America as well. So those are vibrant Mexican communities to this day.
Thank you, Dr. Chávez. Another question is, why did Central and Western Missourian political leaders have such power between 1820 and 1850?
Well, I think in a lot of ways, it's an interesting dynamic. When Missouri is first established, even in its territorial days before it is a state, there is significant power in eastern Missouri, St. Genevieve and St. Louis, and even in portions of the Lead Belt in and around Potosi. There is a lot of power to be found politically there. And in fact, you have someone like Thomas Hart Benton, who is initially playing towards that St. Louis-centric political machine. But as you see the development of central Missouri, Boone County and Callaway County, even Howard County, and even moving west, you begin to see a shift in power. And really by the mid to late 1820s, there is a growing, basically political, we would say machine in a more modern context, but a political group in central and western Missouri that harnesses control not only of the governorship, but also of the legislature in many ways. And we can see by the 1830s and the 1840s, those leaders have deep ties not only to the slaveholding that exists in the same region, but also, I think one or two governors at least made their start as traders and as people working on the eastern end of the Santa Fe Trail. So as the shift in population into central Missouri occurs, as there is a growth of those counties, St. Louis, while not necessarily losing its strength in the state, and that doesn't occur well until the 20th century, and you can still argue the rural versus urban divide in politics today, But Central Missouri, suddenly the political leaders there gain power and hold it well until the 1850s. And then it kind of recirculates as we get closer to the Civil War. But it's quite an interesting dynamic as you see the movement of people into Central Missouri along the Boone's Lick Trail, and then the establishment of the Santa Fe Trail, and that development of Missouri River traffic, and the establishment of slavery from the Upper South, people moving into that region, really brings about a substantial amount of power for people in Central and Western Missouri politically.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And I really don't have anything to add to that, but that's interesting how Benton played a role, who was in fact very important in this part of the state. Yeah,
it's been pointed out in some cases that Benton played both sides. Essentially, he saw St. Louis's power, and then when he saw the power growing in Central Missouri, he also played to them as well, knowing that he could get burned essentially either way, but if he could play both sides, that he could hold power. And ultimately, it's kind of what leads to his strength, but over time is what kind of comes back to get him by the 1840s and the 1850s.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you both. Dr. Chávez, this is for you. Can you tell us a little bit about your work in the Flint Hills this summer?
I asked that again, Paul. I'm sorry.
The work that you're doing in the Flint Hills with the symphony.
Oh, yes. Okay. Thank you. I'll be participating. I wrote a couple of pieces for the Flint Hill Journal, which is published by that group. And so I'll be attending the Flint Hill concerts or symphony and have an opportunity to interact with people. So if anybody's attending that, please look me up, and we can talk a little bit about the Santa Fe Trail that went smack dab through the Flint Hills. So it'll be great to see some of our listeners or viewers during that time in June.
Thank you, Dr. Chávez. Another question for either both of you. Mostly, we'll see. Why did you focus on Howard County in your presentation? What was so significant about Howard County?
Well, I think in a lot of ways, it's kind of as that first map showed, it is a meeting place not only of the Santa Fe Trail as it's not only going west, but also as it's coming east, and that transition of people from St. Louis into Central Missouri on the Boone's Lick Trail as well. It kind of links both groups and provides this cross section across the entire state by the 1820s. And in a lot of ways, it's also one of the first newspapers. The Missouri Intelligencer comes about in the early 1820s out of Howard County. Franklin and Fayette are two early communities. So to get a window into kind of Missouri at statehood in 1821, those newspapers are significantly important because they're not only writing about local matters, about, as I pointed out, politics and the sale of enslaved people, the development of the Santa Fe Trail and other trails, but also making us very much aware that they are connected to local matters, but also national matters, and they're getting news from, certainly by mail, the news of Europe as well and around the world. So it provides an interesting window into state 1821 and the 1820s from people who are living arguably on the frontier in many ways, and how they are not just simply isolated, but they're connected to a larger worldwide network that we often forget about.
Yeah, and the Missouri River, both of those are river towns, if I'm not mistaken. So the river was that vital link with, in their terms, civilization to the east. Yeah.
Right. I believe this will be the final question. Someone's asking about resources. Any books, links that you would recommend our audience to take a little deeper dive into both sides of this bicentennial history?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, the State Historical Society of Missouri with Missouri's Bicentennial has put up a number of resources online. The Missouri Encyclopedia is really a community-based effort to tell the history of various individuals and groups and communities across the state. Of course, the newspapers that have been digitized through various means, Chronicling America with Library of Congress, newspapers.com, as well as the Historical Society's own digital presence, really offer a window of newspapers not only at the beginning of statehood and even in some elements of territorial days, but even pretty much up to the present with some newspapers as well. So those are some great ways to, and especially, I mean, it wasn't that long ago that I finished my dissertation, but the ability to keyword search is something that I think has revolutionized history for so many people. The ability to, I mean, there is something to be said for looking at a microfilm screen and reading newspaper after newspaper and diaries that have been microfilmed. But keyword searchability, I think, is something that makes it a lot easier for everybody. So I encourage people to always check out the actual materials in their physical form if you can find an original diary or a newspaper, but digital materials are great as well.
Yeah, and I would recommend two sources for exploring the Hispanic side of the Santa Fe Trail. The first one is by Thomas E. Chávez, and he's a colleague of mine. He used to be the director of the Palace of the Governors in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and then later the Hispanic Cultural Center in Albuquerque. And he has written a number of books. So if you'll type in your search Thomas E. Chávez, Chavez, you will find a number of books. One of the ones that I used in this presentation from one of his early works is about In Search of Quivira, Quiveir, just like Quivira in Kansas, which was the Spanish name for Kansas. In Search of Quivira, Quivera. That's a great resource for some of the early studies on the Santa Fe Trail and before it was called the Santa Fe Trail. Another book is the one I mentioned, Susan Calafate Boyle, and it's Calafateboyle. Those are two really good sources on the Hispanic side of the trail.
Thank you both. And I'll let our audience know that on our website at kansascitymuseum.org, we'll have a resource link with those. So if people forget, we'll have a little guide there so people can take a little deeper dive. Thank you both so much, Dr. Rost and Dr. Chávez, for sharing your insight on the 200th annual Missouri Bicentennials and showing the multiple perspectives of history. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As a reminder to our audience, we apologize for the technical difficulties, but both presentations will be on our website at kansascitymuseum.org. That's kansascitymuseum.org. And thank you to One Kansas City Radio, who was helping us with all those technical difficulties and for putting this Restore KC on a podcast, so you can listen to that as well. Stay tuned for more virtual programs through our Facebook page. Also, we hope to see you this summer on the lawn for our outdoor safe distance concerts, programs, and events. Until we see you again in this format or in person or this fall at the new Museum of Kansas City History and Cultural Heritage. My name is Paul Gutierrez, Director of Programs and Events. It was an honor and pleasure to be with you tonight. Thank you so much. Be safe and please be kind to one another. Have a good night.